U.S. History, Lesson 41, to the 21st century. This lesson represents the final lesson in our content-driven series on United States history, and it will take us through, with some modest details, the current administrations of the past 15 to 20 years, and also major social and national trends within the United States during this time. On the exam, you'll find there are not a great deal of questions that deal with these areas of components, so we'll walk through some of these things in the most general terms and set you up for some basic content knowledge, specifically to tie back to areas where the exam tests in greater proportionality. George W. Bush Sr. served as a one-term president, and linkages could be made to compare him in some ways as the Martin Van Buren Andrew Jackson comparison, to say that George Bush Sr. was the Van Buren to Reagan's being the Jackson. Reagan had 2 terms and a great deal of economic growth and prosperity coming out of those 2 terms, leaves office with economic downturns follow thereafter, for which his handpicked successor, Martin Van Buren, gets the blame. It's not unlike what happens to George Bush after the 2 terms of Ronald Reagan. In many ways, what happened with Jackson. In 1992, there's a recession which is going to largely be blamed on Republicans who had controlled the presidency for the past 12 years, which allowed them not a lot of wiggle room to argue and say that they weren't involved in the creation of this scenario. Before that, though, prior to that 1992 recession, proof of how politics, domestic politics, Trump foreign policy politics, virtually all the time in American history, in 1990, the Operation Desert Storm invasion of Iraq by United States forces with Saudi allies and other coalition members, at that time with the victory against Saddam Hussein after he had tried to invade the nation of Kuwait and take it over and make it his own, the throwing back and pushing back of that and making that happen, at that point in time, George Bush had very high public approval ratings. It was unbeatable. He looked like he would coast to re-election. The economic downturn is further proof that local politics usually trumps international politics in terms of Americans' voter behavior. The radical alterations of the world map that take place during this time, with the fall of communism, which kind of bridged both the Bush and Reagan eras, resulted in hope for maybe a post-Cold War sort of peace dividend, when maybe the military-industrial complex could be reduced to a certain amount, and what George Bush Sr. called sort of a new world order could come out with a more cooperativist policies on both sides. George Bush had a 75% approval rating in 1991 after the successful Persian Gulf War, but his popularity will plummet with this recession. Economic hard times and the third-party candidacy of Ross Perot were going to take votes away from him and ultimately lead to the election of former Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton as the next president in 1992. Additionally, in order to try to deal with the budget deficits the Reagan era had created, in 1990, the Bush administration passed a tax hike. After famously campaigning on the slogan of "Read my lips, no new taxes," they had to go back on that pledge, and that was used against them in the election of '92. Now, in the 1990s, post-Bush election, the emergence of the internet is going to boost the U.S. economy in this new technology sector throughout much of the 1990s with the creation of many internet-based corporations. This was the so-called dot-com boom. A combination of this, plus good management of the economy under the Clinton administration, is going to enjoy unparalleled economic growth. In fact, it'll be the longest run of unbroken economic prosperity in American economic history. Even though companies downsized throughout this era, unemployment was low. And Clinton saw himself as being what he called one of the new Democrats, a Democrat who did not necessarily believe that Great Society, big government programs were the solutions. Being stewards of the economy and managers of the economy were important, and having some of these programs in place were important, but he was under no illusions that he was going to attempt to try to do an FDR-style vast program. In terms of his foreign policy, Clinton did encourage trade with China, which had been discouraged by both the Reagan and Bush administrations because of human rights violations in China. He also advocated the entry of the United States into NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which eliminated trade barriers between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, sort of creating an economic union, if you will, in terms of trade and commerce. Many argued that this took jobs away from the United States and shipped those jobs away to Mexico, where workers could be paid for cheaper. But nevertheless, this has been the law of the land since and into our current time. Now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Balkans, or the central region of Europe during this time, reverted to religious and sectarian and sectional crises and strife and conflict that had been there for centuries. In fact, this was the same powder keg that started the First World War back in 1914. All these issues and tensions had not gone away. And so as peacekeeping on a humanitarian front, the United States operated to try in the former nation of Yugoslavia and in the emerging nations and the regions of Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Serbia to try to put down or diminish ethnic cleansing or genocide with United Nations assistance during this time. Ultimately, this was still a partisan era deep in the middle of the culture wars that we'd seen from the Reagan era about a rejection of 1960s free license and sort of people not taking personal responsibility for their lives. Clinton's political enemies in Congress investigated him for his ties to some alleged business fraud while he was governor of Arkansas. And during the course of this investigation, it was discovered that Clinton had lied under oath about having an improper sexual relationship with a White House intern. This accusation of perjury led the Republican-controlled House of Representatives to impeach Clinton and actually bringing him up on the charges in 1998. And made Clinton, once this followed through to the actual trial itself, only the second president, first since Andrew Johnson, only the second president to ever be impeached to stand trial for his quote-unquote high crimes and misdemeanors. The trial was then held in the Senate in January of 1999, where Clinton's enemies were not able to get the necessary vote in order to convict him. Clinton apologized to the nation, and he later remained in office. Now, during this time, we actually saw the Republicans gain congressional majorities and, as zealous reformers, try to really actively roll back the Great Society New Deal. They campaigned on a so-called contract with America, which had a series of planks and promises involving the reduction of government, the reduction of taxes, and holding government people to strict accountability, and essentially reverting more power to states at individual levels. And to do so would then be a swing back or a pushback against all of the creeping socialism, liberalist policies we'd seen for 20 to 30 years. This culminated in some ways with Clinton's impeachment, where this was seen by the American public as an overreach. They did also threaten to shut down the government if a new budget bill wasn't passed. The Clinton administration did not accept some of their budget cuts, allowed the government to shut down, and the Republicans actually wound up being blamed for this. They were seen as acting recklessly, acting irresponsibly, and this actually strengthened Bill Clinton's hand coming out of these negotiations for this budget shutdown, which allowed him to more effectively run for re-election in 1996, which he won. The signature accomplishment of the Republicans with the president's assistance in a bipartisan manner would be the passing of a balanced budget amendment. He's the first president and the only president so far, but the first since Dwight Eisenhower to actually get a balanced budget through Congress. And the second one would be welfare reform, which reduced expenditures and placed additional criterion on welfare and welfare recipients during this time and time limits upon how long they could be on welfare. Now, in terms of society changing, society and culture was shifting during this time, irrespective of the 1960s culture wars. Among the demographic changes we see during this time that we are still living through at present is the graying of America, which is a phrase that means the country is aging. That bubble, baby boomer bubble we talked about, as they push through the system, is a large population demographic. Now they're reaching their retirement years. And so issues of retirement, issues of pension reform, issues of Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. These issues are now becoming increasingly important as dialogue-driven issues in our society because there's such a large number of Americans for whom they're going to affect. Additionally, during this time, we see migration to the Sun Belt. What we see is America moving southward and westward is a long-standing trend during this time period. We see Americans, along with this in our population, transitioning more towards, or evolving more towards more of our population being of Latino or Hispanic origin. For instance, the states here indicated in pink, you can see the states of the Sun Belt are states with leading Hispanic populations. They also include Florida, and then of course, Illinois and New York as major urbanized metropolitan states would not be far behind. But we're seeing a movement, a significant movement of Americans that we've seen since 1945 to these regions. That's increased their number of electoral votes, it's increased their clout and sway in Congress, and it's increased the hearing of issues that are important to those regions. Resource rights, drilling rights, mineral rights, water rights are enormously important in these regions, and also immigration. Immigration coming in as an enormously important issue during that time that is still with us to the present day. In fact, the post-1965 immigration surge, what is different about this is historically, most American immigrants or migration had come from Europe. We'd seen earlier waves that had come from Northern and Western Europe, mostly Protestant and Anglo-Saxon in background. We'd seen other waves also from Europe, not Northern and Western, but still from Europe, predominantly Catholic, Jewish, Greek Orthodox in background, Southern, Eastern Europe. And the current waves of immigration we're into now are really not from Europe at all. They're from subcontinent India, Southeast Asia, and South and Central America in sub-Saharan Africa. So we're seeing the country become a more multicultural and diverse place. And this has consequences. It has consequences for changing what it means, changing what the face of America looks like, changing what our cultural values and attitudes are and are going to be as we head forward into the future. Title IX and women. We'd seen the culmination in many ways of the women's rights movements was not the Equal Rights Amendment, which did not pass, but Title IX, which called for no discrimination on the basis of gender for any institution that receives federal funds. And the biggest beneficiaries of this have been white middle-class women when it comes to college scholarships, college admissions, as well as athletics and other college activities. In the workplace, it's had somewhat of an effect, but the major effect has been on these educational institutions. The Bakke decision we've previously mentioned referenced the fact that affirmative action, quotas on the basis of merely color or ethnicity, are no longer permissible, and we are now seeing affirmative action after 40-some years as a federal policy diminishing in terms of its overall constitutional or legal viability within public opinion, but also within the halls of Congress and the executive office, as we're seeing reductions in the judicial branch, as we're seeing reductions made in the scope and span of this program. The culture wars of the 1990s involved in many ways the baby boomer generation at the peak of their political powers at state, local, and federal levels, and all three branches of government, still dueling over the issues of the 60s, the issues of social permissiveness and moral and religious foundations, and revolutions and counter-revolutions or reactionary counter-pushbacks against the reforms of the 1960s. And these culture wars dominated an awful lot of discussion and talks on hot-button issues such as capital punishment and death penalty, gun control, abortion rights, affirmative action rights, gay rights, immigration rights, etc. A whole host of issues involving faith in the family and basic social institutions that were fought out in the 1990s and somewhat into the 2000s, and with a diminishing degree to the current day. The other change in our society is an economic one, involves the rise of the service industry, as opposed to the professions or the manufacturing industry, industries of consultants, retail, personal care, personal consultations, or consultants. These industries have risen, the dot-com industries as well, risen in the past 20 years. And traditional American industries, steel, automotive industries, electrical industries, the production of actual finished goods and finite goods, those industries have diminished over time. And that's resulted in changes in the workplace. And this is why people who expected culturally to be blue collar, who were going to work at a steel mill for 40 years, and their kids are going to work at that same mill and they're going to retire from it, that world has shifted and changed dramatically. And that's changed the expectations and changed the worldview for what life is going to hold for large segments of the American socioeconomic demographics.